1919, January. The silence in the Washington conference room was heavier than the winter air outside. The men of the Westervelt Board, tasked with assessing the performance of American artillery in the Great War, sat surrounded by the damning evidence of their institutional failure. The war had been won, certainly, but that victory had been purchased almost entirely with borrowed tools. Major General Charles G. Westervelt leaned forward. His hands rested on the thick, bound report, detailing every shell fired and every gun deployed by the American Expeditionary Force. The truth was stark and undeniable. The U.S. Army had entered the war with designs dating back to the Spanish-American conflict. To fight the Kaiser, they had relied almost entirely on foreign aid. Of the thousands of field artillery pieces the AEF had fielded, the vast majority were either licensed copies or direct imports. The chief among these was the French 75mm gun M189D7, the beloved, if aging, French Mademoiselle.
"We went to war with our hats in our hands," an engineering officer muttered.
He ran a finger down a column listing US-produced heavy howitzers. That column was nearly blank. The shame was palpable, stemming not just from their reliance on the 60 but from the complete lack of a heavy indigenous capability. When the AEF needed to crack concrete or reach deep behind enemy lines, they used the French 155mm GPF or the British 8-inch howitzer. America, the burgeoning industrial titan, had been technologically dependent on its allies for the very backbone of its fighting force. The review became a crucible of determination. The failure was not one of courage, but of doctrine and design. The board's mandate was simple. Never again would they be caught unprepared. They set a radical, long-term trajectory, demanding the immediate development of a complete family of American-designed weapons. These weapons must be fully motorized and integrated with a revolutionary new system of fire control. The future, they agreed, lay not in the horse-drawn, limited Creverse designs of the trenches. It lay in high-speed mobile artillery capable of supporting the tank armies they knew were coming. This mandate, however, was quickly choked by the realities of peace. The roar of the guns faded, replaced by the silence of the budget axe. The isolationist fervor of the 1920s crippled military spending. The determination forged in 1919 was relegated to the back rooms of arsenals and the dusty drafting tables of the Ordnance Department. For the next 2 decades, progress was glacial. Engineers and dedicated officers, driven by the ghost of the Westervelt report, fought to keep their designs alive on shoestring budgets. They couldn't afford mass production, so they focused on meticulous, iterative design. They labored over the concept of the split-trail carriage, which would allow for massive increases in traverse and elevation. They experimented endlessly with new alloys and recoil mechanisms. The slow, grinding work of the 1920s was dedicated to proving that an American 105mm howitzer could be built. They recognized this caliber as the perfect balance of weight and firepower for the divisional level. Yet, at any given time, perhaps only 3 prototypes existed. The men who designed the M1155mm howitzer and its smaller counterpart, the M2A 115mm, were not celebrated heroes. They were anonymous bureaucrats battling congressional apathy. They had the blueprint for a motorized modern army, but lacked the fuel to run it. They knew that when the next war came, mobility would be paramount, that their prime movers were often civilian trucks or theoretical high-speed tractors that existed only on paper. This quiet, desperate preparation was the true foundation of American artillery power. It was the refusal to let the shame of 1918 fade. They were building a future arsenal in the dark. They laid the groundwork for the Fire Direction Center concept that would revolutionize massed fire, even though they couldn't afford the radios to connect the guns. The engineers believed that when the inevitable crisis came, they would have the blueprints ready. They were waiting only for the urgent call and the flood of industrial capacity to make their indigenous designs a reality. They were waiting for the world to catch fire again. 1937. The dust of the 1930s settled thick over the proving grounds. It was a physical manifestation of the apathy that plagued the Ordnance Department. The work was slow, meticulous, and agonizingly underfunded. Yet, in the deep silence of the Great Depression, a small cadre of engineers and artillery officers pursued the 1919 vision. They sought to build an indigenous modern family of guns. They were not designing weapons for the trenches, they were designing them for the speed of the future. Mobility, they realized, would define the next conflict. The cornerstone of this effort was the 105mm howitzer. This caliber offered the perfect blend of range, shell weight, and transportability for a division. The prototype, the howitzer M2, was a radical departure from the fixed, single-trail French guns of the past. It needed a carriage that could handle rapid repositioning and extreme firing angles. At the Rock Island Arsenal, Captain John Myers ran his hand over the steel of the new split-trail carriage. It was revolutionary. It allowed the gun to swing a full 45 degrees in either direction, a massive advantage over the meager 6 degrees offered by the old Mademoiselle. The catch was proving it could stand up to the shock of sustained firing. It was a blistering afternoon, when the crew prepared the M2 for its sustained firing test. The humidity was oppressive, turning the air around the gun into a shimmering heat bath. The only prime mover they could afford to requisition was a civilian tractor, painted army green, straining under the weight of the gun. The test was simple: demonstrate that the carriage could maintain stability and accuracy after multiple rounds fired at maximum traverse. "Charge 5, high angle," the range officer yelled through the megaphone. Myers watched the crew scramble. The M2 was heavier than its French predecessor, but the pneumatic tires of the new carriage promised high-speed towing once a proper prime mover could be developed. The breech block slammed shut with a heavy, oiled clank. The forward observer, positioned hundreds of yards away, confirmed the target coordinates. "Fire!" The concussion was a physical blow, rattling the teeth of the observers. A plume of white smoke erupted from the muzzle, smelling sharply of sulfur and cordite. The gun recoiled smoothly, the hydropneumatic system absorbing the shock. The split trails dug firmly into the hard-packed earth. The essential difference between this gun and the M1897 lay in the aftermath. The old French gun had to be carefully re-aimed after every shot. The M2 was ready to receive the next round, its modern design holding its line of aim. Next round, traverse 30 degrees right. The crew swung the trails out wide. The new mechanism allowed the gun to pivot easily, a feat impossible with the antiquated box trails of the Great War. This was the key to the fire direction center concept they were developing in theory. It was the ability to rapidly shift massed fire across a wide front without physically moving the entire weapon. The shells landed consistently, punching neat holes in the distant target silhouette. The test was a success, but the victory was quiet. The 105mm howitzer M2A1, the future Army workhorse, was standardized shortly thereafter. Yet production remained a trickle, constrained by congressional reluctance. The blueprints were ready, but the factories were silent. The same slow, painful process applied to the heavy hitters. The 155mm howitzer M1, designed to replace the beloved but cumbersome Schneider M1 1918, was standardized on its carriage M1 in 1941. This was a design that had languished on the drawing boards for nearly a decade. Its eventual pairing with the M4 high-speed tractor would define corps artillery, but for years the engineers had to settle for testing it behind commercial Mack trucks. They were literally praying the heavy axles would not snap under the strain of high-speed travel. There's focus on standardization and indigenous design, extended to the growing need for specialized warfare. As the concept of airborne forces took root, the Ordnance Department faced an impossible equation. The 105mm M2A1 was simply too long and too heavy to jump out of a plane. The inevitable solution was the 105mm howitzer M3, a drastically shortened version of the M2. It was a necessary evil. To achieve the required lightness, the barrel was severely cut, leading to immediate engineering headaches. When the M3 was first tested, the reduced barrel length meant that standard propellant charges burned incompletely. This resulted in excessive muzzle blast and a spectacular flash. Such a display would instantly betray the gun's position in combat. Furthermore, the trails borrowed from the design lineage of the much less powerful 75mm pack howitzer proved dangerously weak under the higher stresses of the larger round. The engineers had to scramble, reinforcing the carriage and developing a custom, faster-burning propellant. It was a classic example of wartime necessity overriding peacetime perfection. At about 1943, the M3 was standardized, ready to equip the airborne divisions, who would soon christen it Hitler's Doom. The years between the wars were not marked by grand parades or decisive victories. They were defined instead by the relentless, anonymous toil of men who recognized a fundamental truth. The next war would be won not just by courage, but by superior mechanics. The standardization of the 155mm howitzer M1 in 1941 and its eventual pairing with the robust M4 high-speed tractor marked the definitive turning point. The U.S. Army finally possessed the foundational designs for a fully modern motorized artillery corps. The moment the fall of France ripped away the veil of isolationism, the Ordnance Department did not have to start from scratch. They simply had to press the print button on the blueprints they had spent 2 decades meticulously perfecting in the dark. The crash program was ready to ignite. The sound of shattered glass and the distant, rhythmic drumming of German artillery had become the soundtrack to the spring of 1940. The fall of France was not just a military defeat, it was a strategic earthquake. It instantly incinerated 2 decades of American isolationism and budget complacency. And, suddenly, the blueprints meticulously guarded at Rock Island Arsenal, the 105mm M2A1, the 155mm M1, were no longer academic exercises. They were the desperate currency of survival. The U.S. Army, finally staring down the barrel of modern mobile warfare, recognized that its divisional structure was obsolete. The triangular division concept, favoring speed and maneuverability over the cumbersome square formations of 1918, was officially adopted. This shift had an immediate, profound impact on artillery doctrine. The 75mm gun, the beloved Mademoiselle, was relegated to history. The new backbone of fire support would be the 105mm howitzer that demanded a massive, immediate industrial mobilization. The field artillery battalions, a meager 25 in 1937, had to swell into an avalanche of steel. They would eventually number over 700 by 1945. The crash program that followed was less about invention and more about scaling. The engineers had done their part. Now the factories had to deliver, but even as the production lines began to churn out the M2A1, the field artillery officers were engaged in a revolution far quieter than the blast of a 105 shell.
This was a doctrinal overhaul that would redefine the meaning of massed fire.
The heart of this revolution was a small, dusty room known simply as the Fire Direction Center, or FDC. It was the early morning hours of July 10, 1943, on the island of Sicily. Lieutenant George Macmillan, a forward observer with the 45th Infantry Division, lay prone on a ridge overlooking the town of Gela. The air was thick with the scent of Mediterranean scrub and the acrid smoke of burning landing craft. Macmillan, pressed flat against the sun-baked earth, watched a column of panzers, tiny and menacing, maneuvering toward the tenuous American beachhead. His radio crackled. The voice of the fire direction officer, Captain Miller, sounded impossibly calm through the static. "Mac, we have you," the radio said. "Give us the coordinates." Before the FDC, this process was slow, decentralized, and agonizing. Macmillan would have calculated the range, deflection, and charge only for his own gun battery, perhaps 4 guns. If he needed support from the next battery over, he would have to call them separately, and they would run their own calculations. The resulting fire would be piecemeal, arriving in sequence rather than simultaneously. But the FDC, standardized in 1941, changed everything. It was a centralized nervous system. Macmillan did not calculate for one battery. He calculated for dozens. He provided a single, precise target location. Target coordinates: Dog 1409er. Enemy armor column. Estimated strength: 8 tanks, moving south. Priority mission: immediate execution. Back in the FDC tent, hidden miles behind the lines, the atmosphere was one of controlled, frantic energy. The space was claustrophobic, smelling of sweat, pencil lead, and fresh coffee. Maps covered every surface, illuminated by dim, hooded lamps. 6 enlisted men, their faces grimly focused, sat hunched over plotting boards. These men were the human computers, working with slide rules, ballistic charts, and plotting triangles. Captain Miller watched the clock on the wall. Time was the enemy. Target 1409er received. All batteries, prepare for time-on-target mission. 6 battalions, charge 7, adjustments on the fly. Fire in 1 minute. A wave of intense activity swept the room. The men did not compute the fire solution for a single gun, they computed the solution for 72 guns, 6 battalions of 105mm and 155mm howitzers, all simultaneously. The FDC integrated variables for temperature, wind, powder lot variation, and the precise location of every single gun in the corps sector. They translated Macmillan's single coordinate into 72 unique firing datasets. This ensured that the trajectory of every shell, from the closest battery to the farthest, was calculated so that all shells would arrive on the target at the exact same instant. Data check transmit, Miller barked suddenly. The tent was filled with the rapid-fire staccato of tactical radios. The data deflection, elevation, and charge was instantly relayed across the wire and the airwaves to the separate gun pits, sometimes miles apart. This integration was a quantum leap. The advent of reliable tactical radios, coupled with the FDC, meant the American Army could mass the firepower of an entire corps onto a single moving target faster than the enemy could react. Macmillan, still lying on the ridge, heard the familiar sharp crackle of the gun batteries beginning their countdown. 30 seconds to impact, the radio whispered. He watched the panzers rumble forward, oblivious. The German commanders expected the standard counter-battery fire, a few rounds from a single battery, forcing them to pause and disperse. They did not expect the statistical impossibility of hundreds of pounds of high explosive arriving simultaneously. The ground began to vibrate, a low, visceral hum that intensified until Macmillan had to clamp his hands over his ears. The sound was not the crack of individual guns, but the terrifying roar of the incoming rounds tearing the air apart. At the 0 mark, the target area simply vanished. A single colossal column of brown earth, pulverized concrete, and shredded steel erupted precisely where the lead tanks had been rolling just moments before. It was not a series of distinct explosions. This was one continuous, earth-shaking detonation, a hammer blow delivered by dozens of guns acting as one unified weapon. The dust cloud rose hundreds of feet into the air. When the smoke cleared seconds later, the German column was utterly broken. The lead tanks were burning husks, the accompanying infantry scattered, their entire formation destroyed. This was the doctrinal revolution in undeniable action. The Fire Directions Center had taken Macmillan's request and, with blinding speed and precision, delivered the punch of corps artillery, sometimes coordinating up to 324 guns and howitzers, onto a target barely visible to the naked eye. This capability, further refined by the integration of dedicated aerial observation from June of 1942, changed everything. American artillery was no longer a defensive barrier. It had become a mobile, responsive, and overwhelming offensive weapon. The transformation was absolute. The U.S. Army had not just replaced its obsolete guns, it had invented a fundamentally new way to fight with them. The rapid expansion of artillery battalions across the globe served as the logistical proof of the FDC's profound strategic value, as the 143, as the 105mm M2A won the Army workhorse, rolled off assembly lines and into the hands of newly trained artillerymen. The US was no longer just equipped with modern weapons. It was operating under a modern doctrine that rendered the decentralized, slow-firing systems of its adversaries completely obsolete. The determination forged in the shame of 1919 had finally manifested as technological dominance, turning the American Artillery Corps into the most lethal and responsive fire support system in the world. The relentless pursuit of mobility and massed fire had successfully revolutionized divisional artillery. But, as the conflict ground into the mid-war years, the battlefield demanded something more: brute, catastrophic power. The enemy had dug in deep, encased in reinforced concrete and protected by their own long-range guns. To crack the Siegfried Line and to reduce the ancient stone monasteries that had been turned into fortresses, the United States needed monsters of steel. The first step toward true heavy corps support was the 155mm gun M1A1, standardized in 1938. It was a weapon of incredible range, designed not for direct assault but for deep interdiction. It reached out 25,000 yards to suppress German railheads, troop concentrations, and, crucially, to silence enemy heavy artillery. This gun was the necessary response to the German 170mm gun. The resulting long-range duel often led to premature bore wear on the M1A1, But this was a small price to pay for the ability to reach deep into the enemy's rear. The Machen 07-ton truck was the heavy-breathing beast initially tasked with pulling this Leviathan. It strained along winding roads until the tracked M4 high-speed tractor, born from the chassis of medium tanks, arrived to give it the necessary cross-country gait. But even the 155mm gun was not enough for the worst of the enemy fortifications. San Diego. Demand brought forth the ultimate expression of American towed artillery, the 240mm howitzer M1. The weapon system was so massive, so profoundly complex, that it seemed to mock the very concept of mobile warfare in the rugged, muddy mountains of Italy, where the Fifth Army was stalled against the Gustav Line. The arrival of the 240mm battalions in May of 1943 was met with immediate skepticism. Major General John Lucas, the VI Corps commander, openly doubted the value of such an unwieldy weapon in such cramped mountainous terrain. Sergeant Frank Dusty Rhodes of the 5th Field Artillery Group understood Lucas's hesitation perfectly. He stood beside the hulking 240mm howitzer, a piece of equipment that looked less like a weapon and more like industrial infrastructure. Its two main components, the gun and the specialized carriage, had to be towed separately. Each part required a heavy prime mover and a dedicated tracked suspension limber just to navigate the soft Italian soil. The process of emplacement was a 2-hour ordeal. It required the physical presence of a massive 20-ton crane. "All right, let's get this pig settled." Rhodes grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. The air was cold, but the exertion was immense. They had spent the last 90 minutes maneuvering the heavy trail spades, digging them deep into the earth. They anchored the weapon with enough steel to absorb the shock of firing a massive 360-pound projectile. The immense, wide-set split trails were a necessity, not a luxury item. The noise of the crane's engine and the metallic groan of the carriage being lowered onto the firing platform echoed ominously across the valley. It occurred that the gun was finally ready. The crew stepped back, awed by the sheer scale of the muzzle. It was a black, yawning cavern. This weapon had been specifically requested to demolish the concrete nerve centers of the German defenses. That included the monastery at Cassino, which the Germans had turned into an unyielding bastion. Rhodes checked the breech. The 360-pound shell was a terrifying thing, requiring a hydraulic rammer just to slide it home. The crew cleared the immediate area. Fire mission Target 3 Alpha 7, fortified observation post. Charge maximum, deflection confirmed. The order came down, and the gunner pulled the lanyard. The resulting blast was not just a sound, it was an atmospheric displacement. The ground jumped, and a wave of compressed air slammed into Rhodes's chest, momentarily stealing his breath. The concussion was so deep and resonant that it felt less like an explosion and more like the earth itself had hiccuped violently. The smell of high-grade cordite was immediate and overwhelming. Miles away, the 360-pound projectile, traveling on a high looping trajectory, slammed into the target. The impact was visible even from the rear position, a pillar of smoke, stone, and pulverized concrete that rose higher and wider than any shell they had ever fired previously. The German strongpoint simply ceased to exist. Fifth Army commanders, initially skeptical, quickly reversed their assessment, lauding the 240mm howitzer as the most generally satisfactory weapon in service in 1944. They called it the Black Dragon. The Black Dragon was the ultimate answer to static defense, but it was slow, agonizingly slow. The 2-hour emplacement time was a crippling liability in a war defined by rapid movement and speed. As the Allied armies broke out of their beachheads and began to pursue the German forces across France, the critical flaw of even the most powerful towed artillery became immediately apparent. It simply could not keep pace with the tanks. Tank officers, leading the armoured charge, clamoured for artillery that moved on tracks, not on wheels. They desperately needed fire support that could stop, shoot, and move within minutes, keeping the critical momentum of the advance alive. The long-standing debate between artillery officers, who preferred motorization via reliable trucks and tractors, and the tank officers, who demanded full mechanization via tracked chassis, was finally settled. It was settled by the simple, brutal demands of the mobile campaign. The solution had been brewing since the early days of the war: self-propelled artillery. In the summer of 1943, during the push through Sicily, Captain Jim Healy rode atop the engine deck of his M7 105mm howitzer motor carriage. The M7, affectionately nicknamed the Priest by the British for its pulpit-like machine gun ring, was built on the reliable chassis of the M4 Sherman tank. It was the physical embodiment of the shift from slow positional warfare to rapid armored maneuver. Healy's unit was moving as part of a column of Shermans, kicking up blinding clouds of dust as they raced toward a village reported to be held by a German rear guard. The heat radiating off the engine and the open fighting compartment was stifling. It mingled with the sharp smell of hot grease and diesel exhaust. 30 miles an hour, boys, Healy shouted over the relentless clatter of the tracks. Try doing that with a Mack truck and an M1A1. The M7 was, by necessity, a compromise. It possessed a high silhouette and only light armor, but its speed was nothing less than revolutionary. When the lead tanks finally spotted the German position, a cluster of anti-tank guns dug into a vineyard, the column did not stop. It slowed only slightly. Fire mission. Targets of opportunity. Vineyard. 1,200 yards. Healy's driver slammed the tracks to a halt. Before the dust had settled, the crew was already swinging the open-topped 105mm howitzer onto the target. There was no time to dig spades or level the gun. The Priest's chassis, designed for stability even while moving, provided the necessary firing platform. Fire! The M7 bucked violently, the muzzle blast scorching the air directly in front of the vehicle. The shell impacted the vineyard, tearing up vines and instantly suppressing the German anti-tank crews. Before the smoke had even cleared, the driver had the M7 rolling again, already repositioning to follow the Shermans as they advanced. This was the future of mobile warfare. The M7 Priest solved the single most critical problem of the mobile battlefield, the crippling time delay between the infantry sighting a target and the artillery delivering fire. The old way required the towed gun to halt, unhitch, dig in, fire, pull out, and hitch up again, a laborious process that could consume 20 minutes. By that time, the armoured battle had often moved a mile down the road. The Priest did it in under 2 minutes. The undeniable success of the M7 led directly to a rapid proliferation of self-propelled designs. These ranged from the improvised T-19 105mm HMC on a half-track chassis used in Tunisia to the massive M12 155mm gun motor carriage. The M12 earned its fame cracking open the heavy concrete bunkers of the Siegfried Line. Built on an M3 tank chassis, the M12 brought the sheer power of corps artillery directly into the line of assault. The necessity finally trumped the initial reluctance of traditional artillery commanders to surrender their independence to the mechanized formations. By 1944, the US Army had achieved a full spectrum of mobile firepower. They now possessed the overwhelming static destruction of the 240mm Black Dragon for siege warfare. Crucially, they also had the blinding speed and responsive fire of the Priest for the armoured breakout. The long, frustrating decades spent designing split-trail carriages and lobbying for high-speed tractors had culminated in a force that was not only fully motorized, but was rapidly becoming fully mechanized. This was a strategic advantage that allowed the Allied armies to sustain a relentless high-speed offensive that the Axis powers simply could not match. The ultimate test of American artillery doctrine was not found in the slow, agonizing sieges of Italy. It was found in the rapid, grinding advance across France and deep into the German heartland. Here, the sheer scale of American industrial capacity and the foundational commitment to motorization became an undeniable strategic force. The ubiquitous 2.5-ton truck, the GMC CCKW 352, ensured that the Army workhorse, the 105mm M2A1, could precisely match the speed of the infantry. The M4 and M5 high-speed tractors pulled the heavier 155mm howitzers and guns, guaranteeing that core fire was never far behind the breakthrough. Mobility was no longer considered a luxury. It was the core mechanism of victory itself. But when the Allied advance slammed into the concrete teeth of the Siegfried Line in late 1944, the need for heavy, mobile firepower reached a critical pitch. The 240mm Black Dragon could certainly crack the fortifications. Yet its 2-hour emplacement time was a crippling liability when the battle demanded immediate response. The solution was the M12 gun motor carriage. Built on the chassis of the M3 medium tank, the M12 fused the devastating power of the old French 155mm GPF with the necessary speed of a tracked vehicle. It was a compromise, an expedient design born of necessity, but it was exactly what the tank commanders had demanded: core artillery that could keep pace with the assault. Captain Ben Carter commanded an M12 during the assault on a heavily fortified German village near Aachen. The landscape was a broken mess of mud and ice, the air stinging with the cold and the perpetual, metallic smell of high explosive. Carter sat in the open fighting compartment, the great 155mm gun dominating his entire view. The M12 was loud, cramped, and entirely exposed to overhead shrapnel, but it was fast. "Hold the line! We're 40 yards behind the assault infantry!" Carter shouted over the deafening roar of the engine. The column of M12s, moving alongside the tank destroyers, slammed to a halt behind a low rise. Ahead, the infantry were pinned down by machine gun fire pouring from a concrete bunker that had miraculously survived the initial aerial bombardment. Carter's forward observer, pinned down near the objective, crackled over the radio. "Target, confirmed bunker position, grid 774, need direct fire immediate." There was absolutely no time for the Fire Direction Center to calculate a complex time-on-target mission involving dozens of batteries. This was an emergency, a localized horror show demanding a direct heavy response. "Gunner, traverse left, elevation 0, direct fire," Carter ordered instantly. The crew worked with a frantic, practiced rhythm honed by months of combat. The massive 95-pound shell was rammed home, followed immediately by the supercharged propellant. The M12's open design meant the crew had minimal physical protection, but it guaranteed maximum efficiency. "Fire!" The M12 bucked like a raging bull. The muzzle flash was blinding, momentarily vaporizing the icy air in front of the gun. The sound was a physical tearing, a violent, high-pressure shockwave that rattled the teeth and left the crew's ears ringing, despite their cotton plugs. The 155mm projectile screamed across the short distance. The bunker, built specifically to withstand the slow, methodical siege fire of towed guns, exploded. It was not just a puff of smoke, but a complete structural collapse as the high explosive round punched through the concrete and detonated inside. The machine gun fire ceased instantly. Before the smoke cleared, Carter's driver had the tracks churning forward. The entire process halt, fire and resume movement, had taken less than 90 seconds. The M12 had delivered the long-range concrete cracking power of corps artillery exactly where and when the infantry needed it most, keeping the critical momentum of the assault alive. This was the fundamental difference between the American war machine and its adversaries. It was the ability to integrate overwhelming firepower with blinding speed. The M12's success ensured that self-propelled artillery became the new standard. Later designs, like the M41 55mm GMC, built on the widened M40 38-inch HMC, were already rolling off production lines by the war's end. They were ready for the next conflict, a clear signal that the era of towed heavy artillery was rapidly closing. April 25. The spring of 1945, the U.S. Army had achieved a complete and total transformation of its field artillery arm. The field artillery battalions, which had numbered fewer than 30 at the start of the decade, now exceeded 700. All of them were equipped with indigenous, modern weapons like the M2A1 and M1, supported by fleets of high-speed tractors and self-propelled guns. The doctrine built around the Fire Direction Center, integrated radio communications, and aerial observation had proven devastatingly effective. It allowed U.S. commanders to deliver more accurate, concentrated, and timely fire than any other army in the world. This ascendancy was not accidental. It was the direct, deliberate payoff of the determination forged in 1919 to overcome the woeful unpreparedness of World War I. The engineers and officers of the interwar years, battling isolationism and budget cuts, had quietly laid the foundation. They perfected the blueprints for the split-trail carriage and the FDC. When the crash program finally ignited in 1940, the U.S. industrial base had the weapons ready to build, and the U.S. Army had the doctrine ready to implement. The United States emerged from World War II as the undisputed global leader in field artillery technology and tactics. The M2A1 105mm howitzer, the M1 155mm howitzer, and the M4 high-speed tractor established the template for the post-war world. They set the standard for the emerging NATO forces. This ensured that the American artillery arm, the true backbone of the U.S. arsenal, would never again be reliant on foreign designs. The shame of 1918 was definitively erased. It was replaced by something entirely new. This force was defined by the lethal efficiency of the largest, fastest, and most responsive artillery the world had ever seen. The lessons had been learned. The investment had been made. American superiority was absolute. If you value these deep historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It is the best way to help us preserve and share these stories. And please, share your own memories or reflections on the power of this transformation in the comments below.